I've only told this to a handful of people, not because I didn't think they'd believe me, but because every time I try to talk about it, my hands start shaking, and that cold feeling creeps up my spine again. There's a scar on my left forearm, a jagged, uneven line about 3 inches long. The doctor said it looked like an animal bite, but I knew what I saw that night in the woods. Growing up, I was never much of an outdoors person. While other kids were climbing trees and building forts, I was perfectly content staying inside with a book. So when my roommate Alex suggested a weekend camping trip, I declined, but he knew exactly how to get to me. He'd said, imagining the photos I could get out there, just me, the wilderness, and that fancy camera of mine. Alex had been my best friend since freshman year of college. Him and his girlfriend Nadi were the only people who could drag me away from my computer screen. That, and my dog Bruno, a 70-pound mutt who thought he was a lapdog. We picked a spot near Lake Wharton, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The website promised pristine wilderness and complete isolation. The drive out was uneventful. Alex's dad's old F-150 rumbled down dirt roads. They got narrower and rougher the further we went. By the time we reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, my phone had long since lost signal. Nady joked that the GPS said we were in the middle of the Atlantic. Alex unfolded a paper map he'd printed from some hiking forum and said that we shouldn't worry. He came prepared. We spent that first afternoon exploring. The woods were different than I expected. Too quiet. Even Bruno seemed on edge, his ears perking up at sounds I couldn't hear. At one point, he stopped dead in his tracks and growled at nothing, just an empty stretch of pine trees. That night around the campfire, things got weird. Nady asked suddenly, cutting off Alex's story about his uncle's hunting trip, if anyone heard that. I hadn't heard anything over the crackling fire, but then a rustling in the bushes about 20 yards away. Too loud to be a squirrel, too deliberate to be the wind. Bruno stood up, the fur along his spine rising. A low, guttural growl I'd never heard from him before vibrated in his chest. Alex said, but his voice was tighter than usual, that it was probably just a deer. We went to bed early after that. I woke up to Bruno whining. The tent fabric glowed faintly from our lantern outside, casting strange shadows. My watch read 2:17 a.m. Then I heard it, the sound that still haunts my dreams. Something was walking around our campsite. Not walking, shuffling, like someone dragging their feet through dry leaves. Slow, methodical. Bruno pressed against my leg, trembling. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands, but before I could turn it on, the shuffling stopped right outside my tent. The silence was worse than the noise. Then a sniff, loud and wet, like a dog, but wrong. Too deep, too guttural. I don't know how long I sat there frozen, but eventually the shuffling moved away. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning brought more questions than answers. Nady's hiking boots were missing. Our food cooler had been dragged 10 feet from where we left it. And the truck, someone had run their fingers through the dust on the driver's side door, leaving 4 clear marks. We found Nady's boots near the tree line. They were soaked with something dark and sticky that smelled like copper and rotting meat. That's when I noticed the footprints. They started at the boots and led back toward our camp. Human-shaped, but the stride was all wrong. Too long, like whoever made them was 7 feet tall and only taking 1 step every 6 feet. We packed up in record time. Alex kept saying it was probably just a bear, but his hands shook as he rolled up the tent. Then Bruno started barking like crazy at the woods. That's when I saw it, a pale shape moving between the trees. Too tall to be a person, too thin to be real. I didn't wait. We threw everything in the truck and peeled out, gravel spraying behind us. The mark on my arm? I got that when we stopped to check the map about a mile down the road. Something reached through my open window and grabbed me. I only saw its hand, long fingers ending in blackened nails. The skin stretched too tight over the bones. The doctors at the ER said it looked like a coyote bite. They gave me 12 stitches and a tetanus shot. Alex and Nadi backed up my story, but I could tell the cops thought we were just city kids spooked by the wilderness. We never went back for the rest of our gear. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I think about what might still be out there in those woods. And worse, I think about how it found us so far off the beaten path. My brother Tyler and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. We'd reserved Site 17 at Pine Ridge Campground, a nice spot near the lake, according to the park website. But when we finally pulled up to our site, something was immediately wrong. The wooden post marking the campsite should have had a clear number 17 on it. Instead, it looked like someone had taken a knife and scratched out the number, leaving only deep, jagged lines in the wood. Tyler looked at his phone, which was acting strange, even though it had plenty of battery left. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked. I checked the park map again. "This is definitely site #17, I told him, but I was starting to feel uneasy. As we looked around, more things seemed off. The fire pit had warm ashes in it, like someone had just put out a fire, but there was no smoke or smell of burning wood. The picnic table wasn't where it should be. Someone had dragged it into the middle of the clearing. Worst of all, there were dozens of flies buzzing in one spot near where we were supposed to set up our tent, like they were swarming around something we couldn't see. We decided to stay anyway. As we unloaded our gear from the car, I noticed Tyler kept looking nervously toward the trees. Then he froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then it came, a steady clicking sound, like two rocks being knocked together. It was coming from the darkest part of the woods, where the trees grew really close together. "It's probably just a bird or something," I said, but it didn't sound like any bird I'd ever heard before. As it got darker, the air turned cold. We built our own campfire, but then we noticed a weird smell, like metal and something sweet, not the normal smell of burning wood. Tyler thought it might be the wet leaves, but then he suddenly said, "Do you smell meat cooking?" That's when we saw the other fire through the trees. About a football field away, there was another campfire burning with strange bluish flames. We could see dark figures moving around it, and the clicking sound came back, louder and faster this time. Tyler jumped up so fast he knocked over his chair. "We need to go talk to the ranger right now," he said, his voice shaking. I was about to tell him he was overreacting when our own fire suddenly flared up wildly, the flames shooting way higher than normal. In that bright light, we saw them, shadowy figures standing just outside our campsite in the trees. I counted at least 7 of them, all wearing dark clothes, just standing there watching us. None of them moved or said anything. We didn't even pack up. We just ran to the car, leaving everything behind. Our tents, our food, even Tyler's nice camera. The car started right away, and as we sped down the dirt road to leave, our headlights lit up the campsite post one last time. Now it clearly showed the number, 17. The next day, the park rangers told us they searched the area, but found no sign of other campers, no second fire pit, no footprints except ours. But when they returned our gear, something was different. My sleeping bag was gone. In its place was a dark hooded sweatshirt I'd never seen before. The Pine Ridge Campground logo on the front had been carefully picked apart with scissors or a knife, leaving only the faint outline where the stitching used to be. We still go camping sometimes, but now we always double-check our site number with the ranger station before setting up. And if we ever arrive at a campsite to find flies swarming like that again, we get back in the car and leave immediately. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the dense pine canopy. As Mark and I trudged up the overgrown trail to Black Pine Ridge, our boots sank slightly into the damp earth, releasing that sharp, organic scent of decaying leaves and rich soil. Somewhere above us, an owl hooted. That low, mournful call that always sounds closer than it actually is. "Told you this place would be empty," Mark said, adjusting the straps of his overloaded backpack. Sweat glistened on his forehead. Beneath that stupid green cap he refused to retire. No tourists, no park rangers, just pure wilderness. I wiped my own brow, already regretting agreeing to this trip. Yeah, and no cell service either. You sure you printed those maps right? Mark patted his cargo pants pocket, where the folded paper map protruded. Relax, city boy. Worst case scenario, we follow the creek back down. The trail grew fainter the deeper we went, disappearing entirely in places where the undergrowth had reclaimed the path. Fallen logs blocked our way every 100 yards or so, forcing us to climb over or go around. The air grew cooler as we ascended, carrying that crisp pine scent, mixed with something else, something faintly metallic, that I couldn't quite place. By the time we found a suitable campsite, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The clearing was small but flat, ringed by towering pines that swayed slightly in the evening breeze. As we dropped our packs, another owl called out, this time from much closer. You hear that? Mark froze, his head cocked slightly. Yeah, just an owl, I said, though my skin prickled at how abruptly the forest had gone silent afterward. We worked quickly to set up camp as twilight deepened. My fingers fumbled with the tent poles, while Mark gathered firewood, his cheerful whistling cutting through the growing darkness. Check this out, he called from near the tree line. I joined him to find strange markings carved into several tree trunks, not the usual initials or dates, but angular symbols that looked almost ritualistic. The cuts were old but precise, the bark having grown around them unevenly. Probably some kids messing around, Mark said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Dinner was a quiet affair. The fire popped and crackled, sending up occasional sparks that disappeared into the blackness above us. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between old friends, listening to the occasional rustle in the underbrush that we told ourselves was just raccoons or deer. It was Mark who first heard the other sounds, the ones that didn't belong. His head snapped up from where he'd been poking the fire. You hear that? He whispered. At first, there was nothing. Then it came again, a rhythmic crunching of leaves. Too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate to be the wind. Then laughter, distant and hollow, like it was coming from underwater. We exchanged a glance, without a word. We both grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the noise, Mark slipping his survival knife from its sheath. The beam of my flashlight trembled as we picked our way through the dense undergrowth. The laughter came again, closer now, accompanied by a new sound, something like metal scraping against stone. Then we saw the fire pit. It was too perfect, the stones arranged in a precise circle with mathematical precision. Inside, the ashes still glowed faintly, though no smoke rose from them. Around the perimeter, small bones had been arranged in intricate patterns. Some sort of rodent skull here, what looked like bird vertebrae there. That's when we saw them. 3 figures stood just beyond the tree line, silhouetted against the moonlight. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. The one in the middle was tall, too tall, wearing what looked like an old hunting jacket several sizes too large. To its left stood a woman in a dress that might have been fashionable 50 years ago, the fabric hanging unnaturally still despite the breeze. The third one held something long and metallic that caught the moonlight in dull flashes. Mark's hand closed around my arm like a vice. His whisper was barely audible. We need to go, now. I wanted to argue, to find some rational explanation. But then the figures took a step forward in perfect unison. We ran. Branches tore at our clothes and skin as we crashed blindly through the undergrowth. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit, not running, but walking with terrible purpose, never speeding up or slowing down. Our campsite was untouched but somehow wrong. My tent flap hung open, despite knowing I'd secured it. Mark's backpack had been moved slightly, its contents seemingly undisturbed, but not quite where we'd left them. We grabbed only the essentials, leaving behind hundreds of dollars worth of gear without a second thought. The hike back to the car took half the time, fueled by pure adrenaline. As we peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind us, I chanced one last look in the rearview mirror. They stood at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. The rangers later told us they found our campsite completely intact. They never did explain the 5 sets of footprints they found circling our tents. Mark and I don't talk about that night much, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I'll catch myself listening for footsteps that don't match my own. And when the owls go silent, I know it's time to leave.